Join Dr. William Hsu as he explains how we can get the benefits of fasting while still consuming calories. Today, Dr. Hsu breaks down the fasting mimicking diet, explains the connection between longevity, nutrition, and fasting, and shares with you strategies on how you can increase your odds of living past 100 and being healthy while doing it. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show. And today's guest is Dr. William Hsu. And I came across Dr. William Hsu's work in relation to something called the fasting mimicking diet. Now, this is probably something you've never really heard of because normally a lot of my viewers are familiar with fasting and intermittent fasting. I've talked about intermittent fasting quite a bit. But I came across his specific work around a fasting mimicking diet. And so it's a little bit of a play on the traditional ways of fasting and even intermittent fasting. It kind of blends this, but it shows you how you can actually consume certain calories at specific times in the right types of calories, in the right time frames, and still get all the benefits of fasting. So we finished this series on energy, frequency, vibration, magnetics, and then we've got a little bit of an in-between before we start our next series. And what I'm wanting to do in this in-between time is talk to a few different people tying in around things like detoxification and how we can clean up our bodies a little bit more. Fasting's got a ton of different benefits that you'll learn about in this episode. Also, I've talked about fasting before. It's something that I incorporate with my patients quite regularly. My wife and I, Taya, we've often incorporated fasting too, either longer fast, shorter fast, but we often incorporate that at various times throughout our week. And I wanted to bring Dr. Hsu on to break this down in more detail. And so we jump into things like what we can do to live 100 years old or longer, some of the strategies involved. And Dr. Hsu takes some of the work that was done in the blue zones and talks a little bit about fasting and calorie restriction and how that plays into longevity. Not just longevity, but we talk about the difference between lifespan versus health span. So as you're living longer, you don't want to be just being able to stay alive through modern medicine. You want to be able to be healthy. So what's the span that you are living longer that you're also healthy? That's ultimately what we're trying to maximize. We also get into some of the different physiological benefits of fasting and break that stuff down. And Dr. Hsu talks about the minimal amount required in order to get the benefits and the gains from fasting. So I hope you guys enjoy the show. And if you haven't, make sure that you hit the subscribe button on both the YouTube channel as well as at the inspirehealthpodcast.com so you don't miss upcoming information on new series that we are going to be putting together. We are cooking up one right at the moment, and we will release that in a little while, probably in the next few weeks. We'll let everybody know what's going to be coming soon. Now, if you haven't had a chance to, check the link below for C60 from Purple Power. Make sure you use the promo code DRLOKEN, all in capitals. C60 is that incredibly powerful antioxidant that helps to minimize inflammation through mitigating oxidative stress in the body. If you are living on Earth, you are going to be under a certain degree of oxidative stress. So many things do that. A lot of the stuff that we consume in our foods, the air, the water, as well as stress, poor sleep, all of these different things can cause an increase in oxidative load on the body. Mitigating that by taking a powerful antioxidant like C60 from Purple Power can do wonders for your overall health. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that you can actually use it topically because it is in an oil base. All of C60 products are done in an oil base. So they use organic olive oil, MCT oil, or avocado oil. And you can actually take those and put those on areas on your skin. It can help with anti-aging and help with wrinkles. If you've got skin that's been damaged by the sun, or if you've got eczema, dry patches, you can use the C60 topically to help to repair that. So if you haven't had a chance, check out the link below and get 15% off your order by using our promo code DRLOKEN. All right, everybody, I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Inspire Health Podcast. And in today's episode, we are talking with Dr. Hsu. So after 20 years of a distinguished career as an endocrinologist at Harvard's Joslin Diabetes Center, Dr. William Hsu joined L-Nutra in 2019 as Chief Medical Officer. Dr. Hsu leads the clinical development effort at L-Nutra, oversees the medical affairs department, and advances the education and adoption of fasting and fasting mimicking diet as an innovative tool to extend human health span. Dr. Hsu, what a pleasure to have you on the show today.
It's fantastic to be on your show. Thank you.
Fasting is a fascinating topic. And this is something that I've personally done myself. I talk to patients a lot of times about it because I find for the most part, especially done in the ways that I'm used to doing it, more from an intermittent fasting perspective, it's not usually that difficult to do for most people. And they can get some pretty big bang for their buck, I find. But when I came across your information and specifically around a fasting mimicking diet, which we'll get into in a little bit, I thought that was really interesting. And I wanted to share that information with our audience. So maybe before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about your journey in getting in from sort of working with diabetes and then gradually segueing into speaking more around fasting and what some of the benefits are around fasting, nutrition, longevity, those sorts of areas of intermixing?
Yeah. So thank you. When people first think of fasting, a lot of people say, not so fast. It sounds difficult, sounds challenging, but I would just open up by saying that, believe it or not, everybody fasts. Everybody does fasting. When we sleep, we fast. So it's not such a foreign concept. But back to my own journey, as an endocrinologist, I have taken care of patients for over 20 years. And despite all the advances, think about this, despite all the advances of drugs, we have now over 12 different categories of medicine to treat people with diabetes. I just give you one example. How modern medicine, as promising and as effective as they are, if you look at the average glucose controls of people with diabetes here in the United States, the most advanced countries in the world, we have not seen that average reading dropped over the last 10 years, actually 5 years, even looking at, despite all the new drugs that have come up over the last 5 years. Okay, that speaks to something about we are really masters of our own health, right? We got to take control of our own health. Medications, we live longer, we're living longer, and we survive because of the advancement in the science that's keeping us alive, but that doesn't mean we're healthier. And with that realization, I came across the research over the last couple of years that looked at how do we translate what's so natural in the natural order of things, and how does science begin to unravel the mysteries of fasting as it relates to our health? And that's a story of its own. And about 2 years ago, I decided that I wanted to come into Alnutra to help to do the clinical research that will open up the world for more people to benefit from taking on a journey of fasting lifestyle. And so here I am.
I think that's fascinating. And I also love that you talked about that we may be living longer, but we're not necessarily healthier. I think that's a really prime and important point, because what I've kind of found over the years too is that people are actually not so excited about necessarily living longer. It's what they want to do within the life that they're living. So, they want to be able to enjoy their life in a different way, which means they have to actually focus on health, not just longevity. I know lots of people that you can keep them alive for a longer period of time, but their quality of life may not be that great. People want to have a better quality of life. So maybe what's the difference then? Because you specifically talk about health span versus lifespan. What's the difference in those two things?
Yeah, I mean, the longevity is something that humanity has always looked for, right? Has always searched from ancient times. Every culture, right? Every kings and emperors, I think they always looked for this fountain of youth, and even common people always looked for that. I think today we're seeing a lot of people living older, longer, but on average they're taking probably 8 to 10 medications, and they're frequently hospitalized with complications of various conditions. So that is somebody with longevity, but doesn't have health, right? And so the difference between health span and lifespan is just that. Health span is the time you spend living healthy, And I think that's really the ultimate goal many of us are dreaming of, although difficult for us to verbalize that, but we actually want to live long and healthy, maybe too hungry, too ambitious, and too greedy. But I think inside every one of our hearts, we want that for ourselves.
Since you've been into the world of fasting, what are some of the big benefits of fasting and sort of what's required? Fasting is one of these things where people think, do I need to fast for a week? Do I need to fast for 24 hours and then eat normal and then do once a week where I do 24 hours? Do I
Yeah.
intermittent fast? Like there's a lot of different concepts tied into this. And I know personally we've tried lots. I've done intermittent fasting is a pretty common one because I find it easy to do. My wife and I recently did a 5 day and a 9 day water fast. We did a longer one, just more just to not necessarily for the change in health benefits, but even just because it changes your relationship with food. There's an almost spiritual aspect to fasting in some regards. But for the
Yeah.
average person that's just wanting to improve their health, what's kind of required? What do people need to be able to do to start to tap into the benefits? And what are the benefits?
Yeah, I think we can start to take a look at the nature around us, to look at the animal kingdoms. Um, we are part of the animal kingdom, except that we have invented something called electricity and we invented something called refrigeration. That totally interrupted the way we were supposed to die and to take in food, right? I think when the sun rose, unless you're nocturnal animals, most animals wake up and go and forage and hunt and do their thing. And then when the sun goes down, unless again you're a night owl, you go into a state of rest. That's the way our body has been designed to do. In 2017, Nobel Prize was in medicine and physiology was given to 3 scientists that found that there's actually inside every cell there are genes that encodes for internal clocks. The internal clock is not just here in the brain, right? We all know about the pineal gland that is the master clock for our circadian rhythm, but actually every cell has an internal clock. And so what we're saying is, hey, look, inside our body is already, nature's already designed this fasting period where we're supposed to be sleeping and resting and not eating. But we've changed all of that with our easy reach into the fridge at night, with our electricity that keeps us up at night for a long, long time. And so, so what does nature really intend for us? So there is that sun up, sun down. We call that actually time restricted eating, right? And so that's part of it, and that's the most common way people are doing intermittent fasting. By the definition of intermittent fasting, you're doing intermittently. So you're not doing for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. You're doing intermittently, and the time restricted eating is the most common one. Now, time restricted eating has many different forms, and a lot of people do 12-12. That's just 12 hours of eating, 12 hours of not eating. It's actually one of the easiest way to do it. And you say, well, it probably doesn't do a lot. Actually, it does. Look at we as Americans, we eat around the clock all the time. Right, when the football game is on, we have something, right? We have a munchie, right? We whenever we turn on TV, when we gather together, and a lot of times it's outside of the 12-hour window, simply by limiting the amount of food that you're eating within a certain amount of window, not necessarily the total amount of food. Now research is showing that there's tons of benefits, and we could go into the benefits a little bit later, but in contrast to those intermittent fasting that we just spoke about, there's also something called the long fast. Not many different ways of calling it. Some people call it prolonged fast. Some people call it periodic fast, because you're doing a prolonged fasting periodically. You're not doing a long-term starvation. Nobody ever says starvation is good for us, right? And so those are generally more than 2 days and extended out to a couple of days. They have a different set of benefits associated with them that are different and distinct from intermittent fasting.
Now, one of the things that you guys have talked about specifically is called a fasting mimicking diet. And one of the things that caught my attention was when it said fasting, but with food. So you're going to have to break that down for people, because most people assume fasting means no food. So tell us what you mean by fasting, but with food. I'm very
Yeah,
curious to hear about this.
it sounds almost like an oxymoron. How can you, yeah, I think it has to do with definition. You think about it, like fasting, what is fasting? That means no food. And I call that behavioral fasting. By behavior, you're not putting food into your mouth. Okay, I get that. But remember that fasting can also be defined on a tissue level, even on a cellular level. So that means that, I'm going to go into a little bit of a science, Jason, if that's okay, for your listeners. Let's try to really get down to this understanding of a cellular fast or a molecular fast. Think about every cell. I mean, what does nutrients do for them? Well, it tells them to grow, right? Or to prepare itself in response to periods of no food, right? So that signal comes into the cells. How do the cells actually perceive these signals? Well, every cell has got these receptors. These are like eyes and ears and nose. They have senses. Are there nutrients here? And for those of you who are interested, that, for example, the PKA receptors, the mTOR receptors, the IGF-1 receptors, these are the eyes and ears of the cells. They say, hey, is there food or not? If there is food, these eyes and ears of the cells is going to say, okay, cell, time to grow, time to multiply, time to grow in size, right? If you're a child, you want that. The children are supposed to grow all the time. But if you're adults like you and me, Jason, what do we need to grow? I mean, it causes to always revving our wheels, always driving that growth pathways. We never have time to rest. The cells never have time to rest. Now, in contrast, when these nutrient sensors are not activated, these eyes and ears don't see nutrients or don't see enough nutrients, what does it do to the cells? It tells the cells to say, hey, there's no food coming in. Let's get ready. Let's recycle because there's no food. Let's take out some of the worn out, older cell parts and let's chew them up and make new ones because we got to do with something we've got internally, right? Rather than going out and get from the outside. And it turns out that these recycling is so fundamental to cellular health. This is a fundamental ways where nature has designed during times of no food, the body uses that period to clean up itself, to do cellular rejuvenation. Now, we as modern people, we need more of those times because we're feeding ourselves all the time. And so now, how do you then, how does that tie into the fasting mimicking diet? Think about this. If we were able to give nutrients in such a way where it falls below the detection of these eyes and ears of these nutrient sensors, then you could actually provide essential nutrients to the body during those fasting period. At the same time, still lead the cells to believe that you're in a fasting state. You should go into that recycling process. And that's really the scientific foundation for the fasting mimicking diet.
I find that fascinating. So what are some of the best foods to look at then that go under detection of the cell receptors so that you can actually literally almost kind of trick the body into thinking that it's fasting, even though you're still getting essential nutrients?
Yeah, so in principle, and this is where the founder of our company, Professor Walter Longo at University of Southern California, has done a lot of basic science research to understand the threshold of the various nutrients that triggers or not trigger the nutrient sensor. So in principle, I think proteins, amino acids, glucose, sugar, they are going to give cells a ample signals that there's food coming in. And so he was able to manipulate these nutrients, provide nutrients in the most exact way that's scientifically developed. So when you consume the fasting mimicking diet, the cells are going to say, okay, it's right below the detection. I'm not sensing any nutrients coming in. So it helps to support a 5-day water-like fast. Now, it's very difficult to do. I personally have never done a 5-day fast. I think it's too hard for me. It's also, I don't recommend 5 days to many of my patients because maybe it's just unsafe for many of them to do a 5-day only fast. And And so this is really a pragmatic way to reap many of the benefits of fasting, at the same time, relieve or alleviate some of the burdens of a long-term water-only fast.
Yeah, and I totally agree. Fasting for long periods of time is definitely not something for people just to jump into doing a water fast. You really do need to make sure that it's supervised properly. And if it's even something that's of benefit for you. Um, like when I mentioned my wife and I, when we've done fasting, we've done lots of experiments with it and we will monitor things appropriately. But again, if you're new to it, just doing like what Dr. Hsu is talking about, when you even just condense your eating window, it's amazing that what you put in that window reacts differently in your body than if that same group of foods was put into a larger window. Can you maybe explain that concept to people as why if you
Yeah.
eat the same sorts of foods but you put them in a 8 hour or even a 12-hour window versus if you're eating foods kind of, every few hours almost all the time,
Yeah.
why does that do something different physiologically in your body?
That is such a good question. It is because fasting is not about just having no food. The way fasting does work differently than a low calorie diet is that fasting is a stress, is a form of stress. And you say, well, stress, I don't want stress in my life. Who wants more stress? But you think about it, in a biologic system, it is, stress is actually could be very good for you. Think about exercise. What is it? I mean, you push yourself on the treadmill, you push yourself on with the weights. What is that? It's a stress to the muscle. It's a stress to the cardiovascular system, right? But just like any stress, it has to be moderate, right? It has to be, it cannot be too long. When stress is too long, it's not good for you. And so why is timing important, right? For a long time, many of the experts in nutrition have debated about what exact components, what food should we be eating. The new dimension of fasting introduces a concept that, hey, yes, 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 components are important, but the timing is also important. And that's because how much time you're giving the stress to the body, right, changes, it pushes the cells to react in a different way. The more time you're fasting, the more stress there is. And so, depending on your metabolic goals, you want to extend that amount of stress or reduce the amount of stress. You see, it's really about how the body reacts to the stress. Let me give you another example. Let's say, during COVID, a lot of people are suffering financially. Okay, but if that suffering is one day, people probably can withstand it, and it's not going to cause too much stress, right? But what if it's a week? Oh, you start saying, hey, hold on, cash flow issue, right? What about it's a month? What about it's 3 months, right? With increasing stress, it changes your behavior. Same thing with the increasing stress of fasting with no calories coming in, it's an increasing amount of stress to the cells. So you want to make sure that stress is not too much, but also too little. It's also never going to change your behavior. It's never going to change the cellular function. Now, fasting mimicking diet uh, intends to do both, giving you the stress to cause your cells to change, but gives you enough nutrients so you could sustain the stress of that fasting. It's like, okay, I you need, let's say, $5,000 to live, in a month, but hey, better than giving you $1,000 than no money, right? Because now with $1,000, you're going to give it to the most essential part of your expenses, right? Rather than spending on a luxury enjoyment, you got to probably pay towards all the needed stuff. Same thing. That's how cells organize this. When you give them a little bit of nutrients there that falls below their detection threshold for these nutrients, they're able to utilize it to reduce that burden, that stress, so you can actually successfully complete a longer period of fast.
Nice. I like that explanation. It makes me think too, with nutrients, how different areas are prioritized differently in the body, right? Different systems. It's like if you're, how even I think about with vitamin C, if you're having vitamin C and then if you get a cold or something along those lines, white blood cells tend to sequester a lot of vitamin C and they might take it from other areas. I find the same thing with like sulfur with different ways too in the body. Or you might pull it for detoxification pathways versus maybe for joint health or something along those lines. They'll kind of get distributed with wherever the body finds most important at that particular time.
You're absolutely right. And the body knows what to do with fasting because fasting has been with us, from day one.
Well, I like anything that ultimately comes back to us sort of abiding a little bit more with how I think we did things really more naturally. And like you said, fasting is not uncommon. I mean, we're used to fasting. And I'm sure at certain points, if back in hunter-gatherer ages, you probably didn't wake up early in the morning and have a really big breakfast. You probably took some time to actually forage for food. So it makes sense, even when I think about how the nervous system runs. I think ultimately we're kind of designed to actually not have our biggest meal probably first thing in the morning when we wake up. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think, one thing clear we know is eating breakfast, some sort of breakfast is probably good for you. I mean, there are a lot of studies out there that show that people who skip breakfast have worse metabolic profile. Now, it's also difficult to tease out because I mean, look at some of my patients who tend to skip breakfast are also the ones that they stayed up late and they stay up late eating. And so by the time when they wake up in the morning, their clock is totally thrown off and they're not hungry in the beginning. So it's nothing to do with whether you eat breakfast or not, but rather the type of the lifestyle that you live, right? So in the literature is not very clear, but from epidemiologic study, there seems to suggest that eating some sort of breakfast after a whole night of fasting is good for you. Now, I think that makes sense because when you do fasting, you're depleting the body of nutrients. You're stressing the cells, right? Even though it's a shorter period of time, but you're doing it every single night when you sleep. And it's really now what we've come to learn is that fasting is only a part of the story. It's really fasting alternating with nourishment. It's the repeated cycles of fasting nourishment, that really completes the story of health, right? Think about it. If somebody always talks about exercising, great. But can you imagine exercising 12 hours a day and not enough rest? That's not good for the body. It has to be breaking the muscles down and building it. Same thing with fasting. You cause that cellular cleaning to happen, and then you replenish the body with nutrients. And that alteration of the cycle is the rule of nature.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So not even as far as when specifically you choose to eat or not eat, but more if you're just following a certain timing. As long as you're falling within a timing, then whether that starts a little bit earlier in the morning or if it starts a little later, as long as you've got your window that you're eating and then your window that you're not eating, is that the most important part of it then?
I think that that's a new concept. I think it's important for us to consider, right? Everybody has a different chronotype, right? Some people are early persons, some people are late individuals. Your own internal clock has a specific, rhythm, and we believe that it may be best to be synced up with the sun, right? That's the way our internal clock happens, right?
Yeah.
But some of us just don't follow that, but it's better to follow a certain kind of rhythm rather than eating 24/7 throughout our waking moment. The latter is not a good option.
I would say that's probably the worst option, is eating all day, all night, and not really following any kind of structured rhythm that nature provides. So you had mentioned some of the foods that tend to throw you back out of the fasting cycle. So you're talking about proteins, sugars, carbohydrates. So are there more important types of foods to focus on when you're doing the fasting mimicking diet?
Well, it's the fasting mimicking diet as it is commercially available right now. Basically, we put all the nutrients you need for that day during the fasting. So you actually do not consume any other food during that period of time because they are calculated, they are specifically scientifically formulated But in general, high amounts of nutrients. I mean, we're a society, Jason, that loves protein, that loves, tons of nutrients. We feel like we never get enough nutrients. We need all the nutrients because we are a society that focuses on performance, right? So a lot of the athletes, they wanted to pack in as much nutrients as possible. In fact, it's those individuals that really need a break from those packing. It's almost like, you think about wheels on a racing car. They great performance, right? These race cars that give us the speed, the velocity, but it's also these are the cars that they need to change their wheels very often. Okay? And so a break away from ample proteins, a high level sugar, I think is really the fundamental principles of fasting.
I often mention whenever I see truths that kind of go over different areas, even across different disciplines, and you see there where they overlap, I always think that those are telling something that's very truthful. So I think about what you're talking about from a food perspective, very much exactly the same what you'll see with exercise. When you see people that are chronic runners or chronic exercising in the gym 7 days a week, they're the ones that eventually will start to run into injuries at a certain period of time. They need to take breaks. You're not meant to go, go, go. You have to take breaks. Even when you think about from a perspective of getting sort of like insights, right? It doesn't happen from going, 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 thinking, thinking, thinking. You have to have periods of sort of downtime where all of a sudden spontaneously something kind of arises. I think of it very much the same way. I talked to Dr. Swami a while back, who's a quantum physicist, and he was talking about a saying that they use, and he says, do, be, do, be, do, be, do, be, do. He says there's times of doing, and then there's times of being, and there's times of doing, and then there's times of being. And you need to have this back and forth in order to ultimately get the insights that instruct your life in different ways, and then you put into action and do it. I really think that actually crosses all of these different disciplines in very much the same way. If you
Yeah.
go, 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 you're going to burn that out at some point, and then you're not going to get all of the benefits that you could if you take these breaks.
I think sleep is also, I mean, it's exactly like that. It's almost like a forced intrusion into our busy life, right? And this is nature's way of designing, hey, we actually need to fast, right? Unless you sleep, eat, which not too many people do that, right? But think about it. I mean, nature is designed it so that sleep is part of our everyday life. And it's and but the challenge is that we as a society sleep less today, right, than 50 years ago. I mean, our adolescents, our young people are staying up at night with the internet and everything and social media. I mean, that's what the number of hours we're sleeping as a society is dropping, and that introduces additional issue because when we're awake, we become hungry at night and we consume, and the time we're not eating becomes shorter and shorter.
Yeah, and sleep's such a big one. So many people have troubles with sleep, and I think poor sleep is related to different types of ill health. I mean, it would be right up there as one of the top ones to correct, I think, overall, if you're wanting to make an impact in your health in a positive direction. Dr. Hsu, what is the relationship with fasting and even with living longer? We talked about longevity earlier and about health span and whatnot, but what do you think is actually possible? What do you think we are capable of as human beings? And where do you think we actually could start to set the bar at as far as how long we could live for?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. It's going back to our earlier in our conversation. A lot of what we learned came from laboratory science. Um, if you take a litter of laboratory rats or mice, these rodents, and if you fast them from time to time, you think you're going to kill these suckers, right? But they ended up living longer. 30 to 60% possible, longer possible. Think about this. And that's because that stress causes the cellular changes, and the cells just recycle some of the older ones for new ones. That is so important that in 2016, this whole process of cellular cycling from the lack of food won the Nobel Prize, right? The Professor Otsumi in Japan. And we call it autophagy, right? And so So it's really amazing that when we think that the body needs more nutrients, but actually when you take away those nutrients in the form of fasting done periodically actually extends animal life. We see this in lower form of organisms, from yeast to flies to rodents to mammals. The big question is what happens to humans. I mean, this is the ones that we're most interested in, right? We have I think a little bit of self-interest here. Um, I think research is still ongoing. We know fasting has always been part of an integral lifestyle for the centenarians. If you look around the blue zone regions of the world, I mean, they don't fast because they want to fast. They fasted because that was their environment, right? When the sun came up, they worked hard. And when the sun went down, they stopped working and they stopped eating. And then because a lot of these are community focused folks, where spirituality and religion play a role in their lives, they practice religious fasting or spiritual fasting. And so it was a combination of intermittent fasting and then prolonged fasting. This was observed in many of the what's so-called the longevity zone regions of the world. And now science has to follow through and demonstrate, right? And looking at, so there's a lot of research now looking into, for example, different kinds of fasting regimen, methylation, DNA methylation on the cellular levels, looking at telomere length, looking at markers of longevity. Now, to do a definitive health span or lifespan study is going to take 20, 30 years. I think it may be a little unrealistic for us to see that results in our lifetime. However, I think more and more emerging signs are pointing that direction. Maybe not just fasting alone, maybe fasting in combination with better sleep, maybe in combination with better exercise, maybe in combination with having the support of a community, right? All these factors, as we see in the centenarian societies, are probably all contributing to a life of health, a long health, a lifespan, healthy lifespan.
Yeah, I think that's also a really important point. A lot of times, particularly I think in Western cultures, we try to cling on to something that's going to be the magic bullet. It's like, oh, fasting, it's got lots of information, lots of research. Then people go into that hard, but they sometimes forget about all of the other pieces that ultimately synergistically work with creating an overall change in your health. The Blue Zone was such an important book. I think anybody out there hasn't seen it, go and check that out, because it really did follow centurions, like the areas in the world that had the most amount of centurions, and they looked at what were they doing. And there was certain key things like you had just mentioned that overlapped in a lot of these different cultures. And sort of a restriction or like a fasting was a part of a lot of them. I remember reading that same study when we saw that in mice and thinking like, that's remarkable, like how much of an impact it can make to just not eat as much, right? Especially in a culture where we've got access to food so readily, but such an importantly powerful tool. We think about what can we take to create certain messages to our cells and to our body, but also what we choose not to do will have just as much of an impact, if not more, in some ways. So I think fasting is a really powerful tool, along with a lot of other pieces that you learn about in the blue zones.
And it is also something that you could do it yourself, right? It does not require a huge arrangement or very extensive commitment here. You also don't need to do it. It's not like a commitment to a lifelong lifestyle change. Would that have been good? Of course. Should we always eat well? Of course. Should we always exercise every day? Of course. But hey, if everybody does that, we wouldn't have our obesity problem in our society today, right? And I'm a little sad to say this, but many of my colleagues, physicians, are struggling with being overweight as well, right?
Mhm.
It's not the knowledge, right? It's just our barriers to actually doing the things we know is right for us, and that everyday nature is difficult, right? But if you are able to do fasting, especially if it's a supported fasting, like a fasting mimicking diet, on a periodic basis, then you don't have to do it. It's almost like I use this analogy a lot of times when people interview me. I use the analogy back in the college days. We, yeah, all of us were supposed to study every day. I don't know about you, Jason, but I didn't study every day. I studied when there was a stress. What stress was that? Well, midterms and finals, right? And so we crammed for days, couple of days before midterms and finals and quizzes. And guess what? Right? We got by. Now, would it have been better if we study every single day? That was probably would have been better, right? But fasting, these prolonged fasting works in a way like this, because the stress of no food for a prolonged period of time, it forces the cell to adjust, to rejuvenate, and to go through the autophagy, right? And so you're going to have health benefits out of these periodically done cellular cleanse. And I think it's a pragmatic solution to our too busy society, where we are having trouble making everyday commitment to a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, I agree with you. I find for the most part, it's most patients that begin this type of a process, it's usually not so tricky for them to incorporate it. I find a lot of times because even initially, even if they're not changing tons of stuff around their diet, they're just changing the windows a little bit and the timing around it. It's easier for a first step. And then once they get that first step, then it becomes a little bit easier to start to work with now what you're having during the times that you are eating. What are you going to fill that with? But the first step develops a bit of a pattern for them. They start to see some results and some benefits, and then it's easier to take it into the next step, the next phases, I think, of it. For listeners that are just beginning, what would be good starting steps for people that want to begin fasting for longevity and for health?
I think you're absolutely right. Let's start with the easy things. I think the easiest way for us right now is almost everybody. Now, there's always exceptions, right? But for most of the average individuals, start with a 12-12 intermittent fasting. 12 hours eating, 12 hours no eating. Simply by doing that, it's going to cut out a lot of the times where we're just eating. Now, just remember, in our society, we don't eat only because we're hungry. Let's be honest. How many times we're eating because of a social reason, right? Friends are coming over, okay? How many times we're eating out of emotion, right? Or out of boredom, or out of habit. That remote control and something, right, to go along with that, right? It's all about those. So by setting a predetermined time, for example, 8 to 8, 7 to 7, something, whatever that fits your schedule, right? It's going to already cut out any time from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. or whenever you go to bed. No food there is going to just already add a lot of benefits to your health.
Wonderful. Dr. Hsu, where can people learn more about the work that you guys are doing, about L-Nutra, more around the fasting mimicking diet and that whole sort of program? Where can we send people to learn more information?
L-Nutra, L-Nutra, this company, L-Nutra is a company that is very different, because our goal is really give the consumers and our adding quality of life to longevity. And by doing that, we got to do a lot of research. And we have 17 active clinical trials going on right now. And if you want to find out more information about it, you can check out at l-nutra.com. That's the company behind the fasting mimicking diet. If you're interested in trying out the fasting mimicking diet to kickstart your January New Year resolution, you could go to ProLon FMD. FMD stands for fasting mimicking diet. So ProLonFMD.com. And for those of you who are interested to start off with intermittent fasting and you find yourself having trouble, even when you're fasting 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours in a day, we also have come up with a product called the Fast Bar, using the same fasting mimicking technology to support you during times of intermittent fasting. So you can find out more about that fasting.com.
Wonderful. Everybody, I will have those notes below in the show notes. So you'll have all of those links that you can check out. Go check out their site. It's I went through that before I was talking to Dr. Hsu, and there's a lot of really interesting information there and links to everything on the site. So you can check that out. And Dr. Hsu, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.